Hello and welcome to Rushing the Field, a special selection Sunday edition. He's Joshua Perry. I'm Nicole Auerbach. A lot to dive into. We finally got the first 12-team college football playoff bracket. Oregon, no surprise, the #1 overall seed. What else jumped out to you as we finally got to see the 4 first-round byes, seeds 1 through 4? We got the home games, and then SMU gets in over Alabama for the last at-large spot.
Well, I'll tell you this. We were emotional every Tuesday when they were releasing the rankings, and I feel way less emotional today because I do think at the end they got it right. Now, there's a structure issue with this bracket and in the way that the auto bids correlate with the first-round byes. Seen people on Twitter talking about Oregon getting rewarded by having to play Ohio State or Tennessee, whereas if you're Penn State, you get SMU and you get Boise State. We'll get that figured out. The thing that I wanted to see yesterday, and we talked about this, was Clemson winning the ACC in a close game because I wanted the committee to have to make a decision about what they were going to do with SMU and Alabama. Alabama with 2 egregious losses, a 3-loss team in total, and SMU, who's played pretty good football. They made the right decision there. So I actually like the way that the committee selected the teams this year.
I completely agree. I made a projection right at the end of the night, and I had SMU in as the final at-large team because otherwise you're essentially saying that conference championships don't matter or that you shouldn't want to play in them, right? Because if SMU went from being comfortably in the field to out of the bracket entirely after a 3-point loss to Clemson, you have a huge problem because no one's going to want to play in those games and you're disincentivizing them. If you're a fan, why would you go to those games? There would be no reason to have them. And right now they're baked into everybody's media contracts and they're part of the deal. Like, you want to get to them. You want to be rewarded. You want to try to win a championship. So I think the committee did what they had to do with SMU over an Alabama team that has 3 losses, and 2 of them are to 6-6 SEC teams.
Right.
Like, those were not good losses, and one of them was a blowout loss only a few weeks ago.
Yeah, and they didn't score a touchdown in that game. Like, I'm really not trying to hear this. And the conversation around Alabama has gotten so off the rails. People are like, well, what's the incentive to schedule hard? Well, they had a not great Wisconsin team in the non-con. They played South Florida, which was not a great game. They had Mercer in Western Kentucky. Like, this is not a scheduling issue. They lost to 2 teams in their conference. You mentioned 6-6 records. Those were not very good teams. I do want to say, though, there is part of me that resonates with this idea that it is much more difficult to win football games in college football than it is to lose. I think people are, like, discrediting the fact that Alabama did beat good teams. You have to draw the line somewhere, though. And if you can't score a touchdown against a 6-6 football team, I think that's where the line is. I don't feel bad for Alabama. But this conversation just got so off the rails to me. It was kind of crazy. But the committee made the right decision.
Yeah, I agree. I actually think that in the first year of the 12-team playoff, if we're really only talking about one spot, and you could say that you don't actually feel all that bad for the team that got left out because they lost a quarter of their games in the regular season and 2 losses to 6-6 teams.
Right.
I feel like the committee did a good job then. This was probably the right amount of teams if we're only debating one. I think the other thing that we could talk about, Joshua, is the order of some of the teams that played this weekend, because this was something when we're looking for potential snubs or surprises. We weren't really sure what the committee was going to do with Texas having lost to Georgia for a 2nd straight time. So it's kind of 1 loss, or is it 2 losses? I don't know. Like,
right.
You're 2 losses to the same good team in overtime. And then you have a Penn State loss, 8 points to Oregon, the #1 team in the country. How do you handle that? The committee basically didn't penalize either of those teams. They went Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame, which didn't play and is ineligible for a top 4 seed. And I think that's pretty justifiable for 5, 6, and 7. They all get to host home games, and the teams that played good quality competition and lost in the extra game didn't end up getting hurt too much.
Yeah, the justifiable thing, I think, is like the most interesting word in this because it's predicated off of this idea of the imbalance of schedules. The only reason we're asking the question about how much do you penalize, can you penalize, et cetera. And so for Texas, I totally get where they're at because it does feel like you lost to the same team. Maybe that's more of a matchup issue than a how good is Texas issue. But also you look at their schedule from this year. They got a pretty favorable draw, didn't have a ton of good teams, so I know that's kind of lingering. The Penn State one we had talked about yesterday because there's the Ohio State thing and how closely they're grouped together. Ohio State with a head-to-head. The only reason Penn State was in there is because Ohio State lost to a team that wasn't them, right? And so it's like, how do you handle that? But again, I think if you're trying to say that conference championships are valuable, and we saw from attendance and from the excitement of those games, people don't feel that way. So if you're trying to say that, you can't penalize these teams.
Right. And again, like, they are valuable, especially to the SEC,
Right.
which I think is why you're seeing, like, I saw a lot of my pals in SEC media making the case that SMU should have been in as the last team in, because that does mean something to get and to win a conference championship game. I want to talk about some other surprises, or maybe not so surprises, but questions that we had for the bracket. We wanted to know who was going to be the number 3 and the number 4 overall seeds.
Right.
We can get into how we don't personally like that, the conference champions have like automatic designated spots in the bracket, but there was a lot at stake. And we saw a lot of arguing, right? As soon as Boise State won on Friday night, whether or not they should get a first round bye over the Big 12 team, which ended up being Arizona State. Both those teams, top 20 wins this weekend.
Right.
But Boise State entered the weekend 5 spots ahead of them, and they stayed. What ended up happening, though, SMU loses, knocks out Clemson, 5th conference champion, because they're ranked the lowest, and therefore both Boise State and Arizona State get first round byes. It is that order, though. So ASU is 4th behind Boise State, which is pretty remarkable. There were a lot of people who thought that the group of 5 champion would always be the 12 seed.
Sure.
And they just beat out 2 conference champions to get that 3 seed.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing to look at. And what's funny about this, like, I don't have a problem with it because, again, it's justifiable based off of what the committee told us they thought about these teams all year long. I do think there is a conversation about maybe did the committee value Boise State a little bit too much. Like, they got off to really hot start. Ashton Genty, obviously a draw for a lot of people. But in the meat of their schedule, there were some games there that were like a little bit sticky at times. And then for Arizona State, they continue to just like play really good football. And then you could go back and look at the losses and say, well, those make a lot of sense. Starting quarterbacks out, things of that nature. And maybe they had them ranked too low the whole time.
Yeah.
And so when you get to this point in the year, I don't think it would have made a ton of sense for them to jump Arizona State over Boise. You told us the whole year that you like Boise better, but the idea here is like maybe they valued these teams one too high and one too low for most of the season here.
Right, and ultimately it's not going to matter that much because they both get the byes.
Right.
Which sort of sets up also some interesting paths for the teams like a Penn State that gets to draw the winner. If look at this. You're looking at the bracket right now. Penn State's playing SMU, the last team in, number 11 seed, and then Boise State in the quarterfinal. Is that a pretty easy path to the semifinal? And then the same thing you got to say about Texas, right? They get Clemson. Clemson sneaks in as the number 12 seed,
right?
Because they were the lowest ranked of the top 5 conference champions. Then they get Arizona State in the quarters. Is that also an easier path to the semifinals? I think you'd probably have a lot of people arguing that that is the case, and I don't know how we feel about that, right? 5 and 6 getting rewarded that much. That's to your point earlier.
Yeah.
Is that an easier path than what Oregon, as the number 1 overall seed, has? Because they're going to play the winner of Ohio State, Tennessee. Ohio State played them better than anybody.
Yeah, it's this interesting question about like how valuable is a bye? Like, would you rather have the extra time and not play that extra game versus having 2 games where you would be favored by touchdown or more, right? Like, I know we do this. And
one at home, right? So it's the risk of injury in the bye versus a home game and then an easier second round opponent.
Right, because if I'm looking at it like the risk of injury, it's I think it's hard to quantify what that is, but if you're telling me that, and I know Vegas has been wrong on a lot of these things, that's why we don't do the hypotheticals, but if you set out a scenario where I knew that I was going to be a touchdown favorite in my first round game, and then even potentially a 2 touchdown favorite in my second round game, I would rather take that than being Oregon sitting back and saying, I got Tennessee or Ohio State. Those are dangerous teams.
So you'd rather play the extra game?
I would rather, in that scenario, I'd rather play the extra game.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's a really interesting question because it gets at some of like the larger issues that I think we're trying to learn from the first year of the 12-team playoff, right? I think, what the committee is clearly doing is trying to incentivize conference championship games still.
Yes.
Because if you put Alabama in over a team like SMU that played and lost a 3-point game to a team that made the bracket, I think what you're doing is saying no one's ever going to want to play in these games again, and we're going to have to get rid of them. And they're baked into everyone's contracts. Again, the attendance, the tickets, the media rights value, all of that is part of it. So I think that's what you're trying to preserve. You're trying to say, hey, we can do a 12-team playoff with conference championship games, and we don't penalize teams that lose them too bad.
Right.
And it helps teams, right? Because it gives them that automatic spot in the playoff. And then again, in the top 4, you get a bye as well. So you're trying to keep that status quo, I think, is one of the messages I got.
And I'm totally here for that. And we've talked about this where people are like, oh, how much are the conference championships going to matter? the way those players were playing this weekend, they weren't hearing any of that nonsense about the games might not matter moving forward. Those guys all wanted to win it. And as somebody who's played the game, I love champions. I love championship celebrations. Bring me all the confetti, pull up the white ropes, just me and my brothers and my coaches out there. That's what I'm in this game for. But you can also, I think, get to a point where we say, you have a guaranteed ticket to the playoff if you win your conference title game. We're not going to guarantee that you get a bye. We're just going to rank them 1 through 12 at that point. And it gives more balance to the bracket. I think people would be a lot more comfortable with that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we'll continue to cover that in the offseason, I'm sure, because I think there's a lot of things that people would change. As we look at the bracket, though, and we were talking about this, about Penn State and Texas, what their paths look like. Look at some of the top teams, at what Oregon and what Georgia face. Who's got the easiest path maybe to the championship game? Not saying they're going to win it, not saying they're going to get there, but who do you think has the easiest path?
Yeah, I mean, Georgia's path seems like it's fairly clear. The question is about the quarterback health, right? Is Carson Beck going to be able to roll? And if not, do you feel comfortable with your quarterback room at that point? It's really hard for me not to look at Penn State with SMU, and we'll get into the game breakdown there. I do think there are some spots of that game that favor SMU, but Penn State's certainly the more talented team. Then you would get Boise State, certainly a more talented team. We know Boise State is dangerous. We respect them. Penn State should win that game. And now you're potentially looking at an Indiana team, which could be an interesting matchup. Notre Dame, I think, could give them problems. Georgia with the banged-up quarterback, that's what you get in the semifinal? Like, it feels like there is a path carved out for Penn State based off of where they're at.
I think especially with the way that they played in the Big Ten championship game, right? Like, that was the best we've seen of Drew Aller.
Sure.
There were a lot of playmakers.
I mean, they were pushing the line of scrimmage in that game against Oregon. No doubt.
Like, there was a lot that we hadn't necessarily seen all the time this season. I think I'm with you. I think it sets up really nicely for Georgia, just because you look at some of the teams that they have, still questions, right? Like, can Notre Dame come back in a game if they need to throw the ball?
Right.
Indiana, they lost the game against the most talented team that they played this year. So, like, we have some questions about that for a potential quarterfinal matchup. And then, like you said, Boise State getting the 3 seed is huge, because now that would be your potential semifinal opponent as well. Oregon, I get that it is a challenge, right? I get that that is one where people are going to say, like, they did not get rewarded for getting the #1 overall seed. And the question then becomes, what system is in place where you don't want to be the #1 overall seed? That's not a good system. If you're always going to get a hot team that's like in the 8-9 range, don't love that. But I still like their path too.
Sure.
I mean, again, it's Ohio State team that they beat.
Right.
I know it was close.
Right.
But Oregon's been the most consistent and good team the entirety of the season. Tennessee's got issues offensively.
They do.
So I still like that matchup. It's also going to be at the Rose Bowl, right? Because you're also getting a little protection in terms of travel and locations. But I also think you got to feel good about Texas, right? For the same reasons as Penn State, because you get through Clemson, the weakest of the conference champions. Arizona State got real hot late, but again, they've been way down in the way that we've talked about a lot of these teams. And then you wouldn't get, Oregon until the semifinals.
Right. No, I'm there with you. Like, you're looking at Texas and their path. Like, certainly Clemson is one where the talent is equated in a game like that, but they haven't always played up to their talent. If you're Texas, you feel like you can win that one. And then to your point, now you're looking at rosters again for Arizona State. The Oregon thing, just to circle back, the reason I think we like that path is because we like Oregon as a football team. We like the way they're constructed. We like their head coach a ton. We like the way that they've played all year long. That's why they're #1, and I don't think they care what the bracket looks like, to be perfectly clear. This is just us in the media talking about it. And so, do I like Oregon's path? I like Oregon, so of course I like their path.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair way to put it as well, right? I mean, and again, they were the obvious #1 overall seed. They went unbeaten this year. We've talked so much about how, hey, maybe there's increased parity this season, the transfer portal, NIL,
not for
maybe
them.
even Nick Saban's retirement, right? Like, but then they go and win all of their games, and so maybe there is a great team. Maybe by the time we get to the finish line here, we do find out that there was one great team in college football this year and a bunch of good teams that had their ups and downs.
Right.
We'll see. I mean, Oregon would certainly earn it. That's one thing that I think really jumps out when you look at the bracket. How many games against good teams you have to win to win a national championship now?
Yeah, it's the thing that we talk about, right? Like with my alma mater, for example, and the head coach in the conversation. It's like, people would say, oh, it would make Ohio State fans feel better to win a national title in the year that they
just go win a national title.
Right.
Yeah, it's so easy, right?
Okay, so let's beat Tennessee, and then you got Oregon after that, and then Potentially you got Texas, and then
Mm-hmm.
maybe you got Georgia or Notre Dame, who's played some pretty good ball to win a national title. I don't know about that one.
I mean, but that is something that really stands out because we have been having that conversation about how does Ryan Day make up for that loss to Michigan. You do have to go through some really, really good teams to do it. And this is what I think we wanted with the 12-team playoff. You wanted a lot of this to be decided on the field. You didn't want the committee just saying, hey, you know, we think you're better than Indiana, so this is going to be the order we rank the teams. This determines the bowl games. Oh, and Boise State, nice season, but you were nowhere near the 4-team playoff bracket. So I think that part's going to be really cool. I mean, the first round games really enticing. The quarterfinals, we've also see some really intriguing matchups. You do have the potential rematch for Ohio State, Oregon, but otherwise, we're going to see a lot of new matchups. We're getting like a State of Indiana clash
which is
with the
great.
Hoosiers and the Fighting Irish. There's a lot that jumps out here. And I want to talk about just the overall message that the committee is sending by giving us this bracket, making the decisions that they did with SMU over Alabama, and also all of the things that we're talking about, the ordering of teams, the top 4 seeds getting buys. What are we learning? What does this committee want us to take away from this?
Okay, so I think it's really twofold. Is number one, we talked about it a little bit. Winning your conference matters, and we're not going to hurt you if you go to the conference championship game and lose it, which I think is important. What they did with SMU there in a tight game, right? The way that they treated Penn State and the way that they treated Texas, they wanted to make that a big deal still, and it should be a big deal. Not a perfect way to do it with the way that the bracket comes together, but this idea of conference championships having to matter is important. The second thing I will say is I think they kind of looked at people who have looked at the committee historically and said, you're a brand biased committee. You value brands more than you value good football teams. Put Indiana in there. There was no question coming into the weekend that Indiana was going to be one of these teams. SMU, again, put them in there, and there was a question. Do you take SMU? Do you take Alabama? And for the teams that want to go out there and lose to Oklahoma and not score a touchdown, for the teams that want to lose to Kentucky at home and then tell us about how great the road environments are in their conference, for those teams, we're not even looking at you. You're not going to get in here. And I think that was a great message to send. Handle your business.
Yeah, usually we don't always get messages about the quality of losses, right? Because you hear about the wins. But I think making the point about the losses that Alabama had is still valuable. And they went out of their way to also point out that it still incentivizes strength of schedule. Because the only reason Alabama was as close as they were was because of the strength of schedule that they had. I agree with you. I think there was a statement made about, Indiana after they only had one big game on their schedule and they fell short. They didn't fall out of the bracket.
Right.
And the committee made a point, you can only play who you can play. And I think that's a really important message in the era of mega conferences because they're going to be imbalanced. Like Indiana's schedule was not the same as Ohio State's schedule. But they're never going to be unless historically the trends are the same, and so they schedule them similarly. So you're going to have to weigh that every single year, and I think that's something the committee said was we're just going to try to evaluate based on what you had. What you couldn't control was what your league gave you as your schedule, so we don't want to penalize in Indiana or in SMU too much on who they avoided based on the way the schedule fell.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at Indiana's schedule coming into the year too, you had the national championship winner from a year ago. You had the team that played in the national championship game against them.
Should have been better.
It's not Indiana's fault that those teams weren't as good this year, right? That's a part of this conversation too. It felt like it was a more balanced schedule when we looked at it in August, and now we're sitting here saying, well, they handled business up against what they had.
Right. So I think that's one message that I'm taking away from the committee. I think the trying to incentivize the status quo is another one from the committee because they did not want to blow up the system. They did not want to get rid of conference championship games, which they could have. That message would have been sent. If you take Alabama, who didn't play this weekend, and you put them ahead of an SMU team that had 3-point loss to Clemson, no one wants to play those games. No one's going to play those games. You're going to literally be incentivized to rest players and try to lose down the stretch to not play in those games. So I think that's a really important message. I think also if you go for Alabama, you do run into so many issues about brand bias, the way decisions are being made. Are you just kind of deferring to the SEC and the Big Ten to fill out the bracket? I think picking SMU, structuring the bracket the way they did with Boise State, being above 2 Power 5 champions, is the committee saying, we care about all of college football. We are trying to do what is the healthiest and smartest decision for the entire sport.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think that's what they were trying to do, and particularly with Boise State. That goes a long way for the group of 5. And we were talking about many teams here. We're talking about Army late in the year and Tulane and some of these other programs. And with all the movement and the TV contracts and everything, I do think it is healthy that the group of 5 can remain a viable place for players to go and ultimately have a path to compete in the postseason. There's also a question that lingers in my mind. Are we trying to make the sport healthy, or are we trying to crown the best champ every year? And both of the things can be the same in certain scenarios, but it's not always going to be like that. So I'm curious what the committee is going to end up doing in a year where it maybe is a little bit more clear that, like, the SEC is way up, the Big Ten might be way up, and the group of 5 should just be in by the skin of their teeth on the auto bid, how they handle those brackets.
Yeah, and we'll also see how Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, responds to this, right? He had been very much politicking. We had a lot of commissioners going out in the media making their cases, and I think that he will be upset the way that Alabama and Ole Miss and South Carolina were treated down the stretch.
He needs to tell Oklahoma not to bring their A game when they play Alabama.
And Vanderbilt as well, right?
I mean,
these were league games.
Did he tell those teams to read the newspaper before the game, see what the point spread is, and then play like it?
Well, yeah, the hypothetical games don't count. The 22-point spread doesn't matter if you don't win the game. But that is going to be something to track too, because we're wondering if there's going to be tweaks, changes. We'd like to see the seeding piece get changed as well. So those are off-season questions now that we see how this plays out. Let's get into the games themselves. Now we finally have 4 first-round games. Let's break them down, okay? Let's start with Clemson traveling to Austin. They will take on Texas. That game is at 4 p.m. on Saturday, December 21st. Okay, first of all, heavy hitters. A lot of orange, different shades of orange. But this is a really interesting matchup because we wondered, if Texas would get hurt more by losing the SEC championship game. They don't, right? They still get the great spot as a number 5 seed, and they draw Clemson, a team that would not have made the field if they didn't win the ACC championship game. Joshua, I want to start with the quarterbacks in this game because it feels like they are going to be a story, big narrative game for the quarterbacks.
I would agree with that. I mean, Cade Klubnik, after Clemson's opening game with Georgia, I think we kind of wrote them off a little bit. And Cade Klubnik's been playing really good football throughout the season. Very productive offense for Clemson. They move the ball up and down the field. That's not their issue this year. But then you look at Quinn Ewers, who was like, could he be quarterback 1 in college football? Could he win the Heisman this year? And I think he's been just good. But in some of the big moments, he's kind of fallen flat. The first game against Georgia, he was spooked for a lot of the game. He was getting hit like he just didn't look like himself. And then even in this last one, he hit some big shots down the field. I think he tries to place the ball a little bit too much, and so you get some issues with how it's delivered out to the edges, and then ultimately a couple of turnovers there. I think eyes are going to be on the quarterbacks to start. But where I would shift after that is either one of these defenses is going to have a big save. Clemson plays defense the way they have this year. I think Texas is going to be able to move the ball. In Texas, going up against a high-powered Clemson offense, their defense is going to have to play their best game, which they've been really good all year long.
Yeah, and to go back on the Quinn Ewers point, right, like I think we have a lot of questions about his play in the biggest games against Georgia, right? Like the way that he played in those 2 games. What's different with the Clemson defense, with their weaknesses, with their strengths? And then do we see Arch Manning? I mean, I think you have to think yes, certainly in different packages in the way that they use him. But I think that could be a wrinkle that ends up being significant in this game for a Clemson team that can be up and down. And when they've lost games, they've gotten beat pretty badly. So I think you run into that risk as well if you're Clemson going into this atmosphere for the very first time, an on-campus playoff game. You gotta keep pace early.
I mean, this is a Clemson team in some of their losses that have given up 30 points, right? Like they've done that in wins this year. It's certainly a defense that has had its issues. But one thing that stood out to me, though, against SMU, that secondary for Clemson had those guys in a blender. And I like the SMU skill players there. So, like, there's also this question for me of, like, is Dabo still a guy in a big game who can get it done? Like, do we trust that in this scenario, right? Conference championship.
I was going to say, did we feel that? Did we learn that this past weekend in
I don't
Charlotte?
know. I mean, yes and no, right? Like, jump out on a really good SMU
and then
team.
almost blew it.
But then had yourself set up, right? Like, you get the big return when you need it. Then your field goal kicker goes out there.
56-yard
young guy, right? But he didn't feel any of the pressure of the moment. Went out there, swung his foot, ball goes through. Like, is he still a big game coach? And then for Sark, we watched you make it to the playoffs last year. And then what happened, right? Like, can you become the guy who's the big game coach now? I'm very curious about all this.
Yeah, I talked to a bunch of Texas players throughout the year of like what they learned. And like, I do think you learn something by getting there.
Oh, yeah.
And certainly, that was a great game against Washington that they came up just short. But what do you take from that you can use now? With a Clemson team that hasn't been in the playoff, by the way, the last few years. Like, they don't have guys on that roster who've been there every single year like they used to. That one's going to be really fascinating. Plus the idea that Clemson's kind of playing with house money a little bit. Like the way that they celebrated that ACC championship game, the way Dabo Swinney's been talking about this team.
I'm telling you.
They're pretty fearless, and they're not going to be predicted to win this game. They're going to be underdogs against Texas. And then the questions that we have about Texas are just kind of always going to be there, right? They've been thin at the running back position all season. We have seen their offensive line get pushed around against Georgia at times this season. How do they handle those moments? I think it's going to be really interesting. But that one's going to be fascinating, I think, just based on the storylines coming in and, like you said, kind of the legacy-making moments for the quarterbacks.
Yeah, it's going to your legacy is great. Like, it's going to be a legacy game. I think more so for Quinn Ewers and for Cade Klubnik, but also, like, the coaching storyline, too, about, is Dabo's run truly over? Right? Like, is this the true end of the dynasty? You make it into the playoff, lose in the first round. Can we kind of push it to the side? And then is Sark going to be the next guy up?
Or did Dabo already push back on that narrative? We were ready to write him off and, like, end the legacy and the dynasty in week 1 when they go and lose to Georgia. They had their ups, they had their downs, they fought through, they won the game that they needed to get.
I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at. It's like
no, that's what's at stake, right? Like, are you still in the uppermost echelon of college football, Clemson?
Lose to your rival, go to the ACC champ, win the game. It's a weird year, and yes, I do think we have to ask the question: is the window still open for them?
All right, let's move to Indiana at Notre Dame. This is the Friday night game, 8:00 Eastern. This is basically bragging rights for the state of Indiana. Pretty cool matchup because we did not get this in the regular season, even though both teams had great runs, especially, and very dominant. Like, these are two of the most dominant teams in the country all season long. And we get to see them face off against each other. I will be at this game, so I'm personally very excited about this particular matchup. But I want to talk about, Joshua, where this starts, right? The reason that Notre Dame was a 7 seed and not higher is that Northern Illinois loss.
Right.
We've talked about it over the course of the season, but as we head into the postseason, I think it's really important. After that game, there was no margin for error for Notre Dame. They had to win. They won 10 straight. They won a lot of those games in dominating fashion. That win over Army, certainly a huge feather in the cap of the resume.
Yep.
But they became really dominant. The defense is elite. The run game is elite. But we still don't know, if you get into a shootout, how the passing game would perform with their backs against the wall. I will say, in December in South Bend, there could be snow, there could be sleet, there could be hail. They might not need to throw the ball.
Right. It's going to be. I think this is a whose trenches are gonna win type of game for me. It's interesting you bring up this idea of may not have to throw the football. I don't know, regardless of what the conditions are, that Notre Dame shouldn't come out and try to loosen up this Indiana defense. We're looking at a Notre Dame team that's number 10 in rush offense nationally. We know exactly who they are. Indiana, statistically, and people will be like, oh, well, who have they played? Statistically, best rush defense in the country, right? Like, it's up there with anybody in college football. They're going to have a plan. I think one of the best things that Indiana's done all year long is they have created defensive game plans that have allowed their players to rise to the occasion, right? Like, they don't have the type of players Notre Dame has, but they get the same type of production because of scheme. And so I think there's going to be an interesting back and forth when it comes to the scheme and how you want to start the game, what you need to do throwing the ball if you're Notre Dame to try to get this Indiana run defense has been tough all year off your back. Now, looking at the other side, this is where it gets dicey.
I mean, this is an Indiana team that when they have gone up against defensive fronts with guys who are going to play on Sunday, they've really struggled. They've really struggled with the type of athleticism, the physicality, the speed. Michigan was really the first time that we saw them struggle, and that was because of the front that they went up against, and then Ohio State as well. Can they improve that over the course of the season? Like, is that just going to be a weakness, and they're going to have to just try to protect Curtis Rourke as long as possible, try to run the ball, whatever they can, and just, like, pray for the best?
This is the difference in a program like Indiana, who certainly has done a phenomenal job this year. I think Cignetti's going to build that into a very dangerous program. But when you're taking over that job, where you can supplement with skill, fairly easily. It's really hard finding big guys who are really good players. And I'm talking about transfer portal
that
offense.
aren't somewhere else.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you get them through the portal, like offensive linemen that hop in the portal, it's kind of hit or miss. And so that's where they were exposed. Against Michigan, they only ran it for 40 yards. Against Ohio State, they ran it for 83. They were sacked 9 times in those 2 games. And for the rest of the season, in all the rest of their games combined, 9 sacks that they allowed. Right. Like, it is a real difference. And Notre Dame's going to be the same type of animal with the players that they have in their front 7. Even banged up, Notre Dame is still able to roll guys through. And so this is not something that I think a little extra practice time is going to help out. Like, they're going to have to get players in there at some point that are more of the high-profile offensive front type guys. I don't know what that means for their game plan. And This is a secondary, too, for Notre Dame that has been so good. They take the football away, they hit, they tackle. Like, that's the side of the ball that I'm really struggling with.
Yeah, and it makes sense that would be Notre Dame's advantage. I mean, we've seen it all season. Even when they've had injuries, that defense has been super, super dominant against a competition. The interesting thing with this matchup, too, is these 2 teams, Notre Dame and Indiana, have both not had a ton of big games, right? Like I talked about, Notre Dame had no margin for error. They had to win all of their games after NIU. But, Florida State was down.
Right.
Louisville up and down, and there were like a million turnovers in that game. Navy was handing the ball over. Army was a big game, and they were dominant in that. But they didn't have, even USC, they weren't really like the tests that they sounded like they were going to be. And that's where you wonder again just about the top end for Notre Dame and what that looks like, or when they're up against great teams. That's what makes this one really, really interesting, because Indiana had Michigan and Ohio State, and then they crushed pretty much everybody else. We really like Curtis Rourke. I think he could be an NFL backup for a long time. But in terms of like the skill level, how many times they went up and down over the course of the season, like it's going to be really interesting to see 2 teams that weren't challenged on a week-to-week basis be challenged at the same time.
Yeah, I think the one thing I do take away from Notre Dame and watching them this year is they carved out a really strong identity that I think is going to play in the postseason, where we talked about how good the defense is and their ability to run the football. And I think that you can go into games with those 2 things and always give yourself a chance. And the thing is, as much as I love Indiana for this year, the thing that does give me pause is when it comes to run game being established in something like this. And, defensively, are you going to be able to get all of the stops with those big guys leaning on you all game? There's a little bit of a question there for me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those matchups for Indiana where they're up against the dudes that they don't have, right? They have these group of 5 players stepping up and building this thing for Curt Cignetti.
And they've done a great job.
And it's going to get better and going to get better. Also going to be fascinating to see how many Hoosiers make it to South Bend.
I would love to see.
That stadium can get overrun by opposing fan bases.
This is also a uniform matchup that I actually do enjoy. Like, the contrast in there is going to be great.
That one's going to be awesome. All right, let's go over to State College.
Ooh.
Penn State, the number 6 seed, is hosting SMU. So we are going to talk about that game. The Penn State coming off of a really impressive performance, I think, against Oregon in the Big Ten championship game. We think that they had a pretty favorable schedule here because they would draw Boise State in the second round. They also get the final at-large team in an SMU team that has a lot of speed, but we saw was challenged against Clemson and the types of athlete that Penn State also has.
Yes.
I also think a home field advantage is going to be pretty significant in this because State College, Beaver Stadium, one of the best places to play in the country. It's not at night.
No.
This game is at noon.
Oh, man. No, I'm there with you. I'll start off with this aspect of it. This is James Franklin time, right? Like, this is what it is. They had the opportunity to go play in the Big Ten championship, not of their own doing necessarily, and they played a really competitive game, but that was another loss for James Franklin against a really good football team. And you see people were a little torn because of this one. Guys were ready to play, no doubt, just didn't get it done. But there are people who are like, can James Franklin actually get it done? Well, you might not have to play as many great teams as anybody else. The opportunity is on a silver platter for him, right? SMU, and I'll get into the X's and O's because I do think SMU can be tricky in this one. They should beat SMU. They should beat Boise State.
Yep.
And now at that point, it's like, James Franklin, you got to go. This was the setup for Penn State. We talked about the 12-team playoff. We talked about Penn State and how much they needed something like this. Now it's time to show up.
Well, exactly. That's where I think this starts, right? They were the poster child for the 12-team college football playoff. They were the ones that would have been in it the most over the last 10 years if this was the bracket and the way that it worked. Ton of pressure to get here, and then a ton of pressure to host a game in the first round as well. They get both of those things, despite, by the way, one top 25 win over Illinois. But they have great losses, and they played the great teams that they lost to pretty well.
They have great losses.
The committee clearly values that, right? They think that Oregon's really good. They think Ohio State's still pretty good. So they learned a lot about how Penn State played those two teams. So they get the benefit of the doubt. They get to host a game. And I think I'm with you, too, that they should be able to win it. This is a team that is incredibly talented. Drew Aller got to be as confident as he's been all season.
Yeah, I mean,
coming off what we saw in Indianapolis.
He was spinning it really well. I mean, just as a team, I think Penn State should take – I don't like moral victories. They should take a lot of confidence from that. But Drew Aller, like, he had some plays where he was off of his spot, had to keep the play alive, delivered a very accurate pass. He used his legs when he needed to as well, which for Oregon, like, better game plan in terms of your rush lanes. But, like, Drew Aller having the presence of mind in those scenarios to say, I'm going to give up on the throw and I'm actually going to make a play with my legs. Like, he looks like a much better quarterback than he did last year and at the start of this season.
But here's a question. We also saw Oregon's skill players, like, running free.
By everybody.
Yeah, running by everyone. They were also really open.
Yeah, they were.
SMU, one of my favorite things about Rhett Lashley, because I also really like how he built his program.
I do too.
He says speed is the most important thing. They're going to get guys that have it. And that's one thing that I think could be a problem with Penn State's secondary based on what we just saw Oregon do to them. So that's got to be an advantage for SMU as you're looking X's and O's wise.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about it all year long. Penn State fans hated me at times for saying it. Their secondary is not particularly fast. I don't look at them and say, wow, there's elite speed in that secondary. I think they have good players. I think they play with great angles, great leverage. They can make tackles in space. They are not a particularly fast secondary. We saw what Tez did. We saw what some of those other guys for Oregon did to him. And I think SMU, maybe not the elite level of Oregon skill. They got guys who can run, though. And I do think if Penn State's defensive line does not consistently get pressure, there will be opportunities in that secondary for SMU to kind of pick them apart there. Now, that is a big if. SMU is going to struggle to block those guys up front. Penn State has done a phenomenal job of bringing in game changers on that defensive line. Edges, interior, does not matter, and I like the blitz packages too. But if they're not getting home, I think SMU is going to move the ball a little bit.
That's how the front end helps the back end of the defense. That's how that one works. That one's going to be a really fun one in one of the best atmospheres in all of college football. Let's talk about your Ohio State Buckeyes.
We don't have to.
We do. They are hosting Tennessee. This was a matchup that I think most of us figured was going to happen based on where these two teams have been ranked the last couple of weeks. The Buckeyes are the final team that got the ability to host, and this game will be primetime on Saturday night at the Shoe, so not a noon game.
I know the people in Columbus are happy about that.
Very happy about that. But let's talk about this, okay? So this is an Ohio State team coming off an embarrassing and bad loss to Michigan. And everyone's wondering, hey, what's the future for Ryan Day? Well, okay, just go out and win a national championship now. That'll get everyone forgetting about 4 straight losses to Michigan. Really hard to do. But I do think they have a really big opportunity against the Tennessee team that I'm not very sold on. I think the offense has been very inconsistent this season. The defense has been exploited at times as well. But I think that Ohio State is going to be favored in this game, and I think that they should be able to handle Tennessee.
Yeah, let's go through some of the ranks here. So scoring offense, Ohio State, number 16 nationally, and scoring defense, Ohio State is number 1 nationally. For Tennessee, they're number 8 in scoring offense nationally, and they're number 4 in scoring defense, right? Like, these are very similar teams. They're very balanced teams. To your point about Tennessee's offense, they've been inconsistent. Guess who else's offense has been inconsistent? Ohio State.
Yeah.
Their ability to run the ball just depends on the day and how that patchwork offensive line is feeling. Like, I do think that these are teams where you're like, there are many things to like, but you just don't know what you're going to get on a given Saturday. I'll say 100%. I felt this way coming into the year. Now with the offensive line injuries for Ohio State, I feel more strongly about this. The trenches are going to win these games. The trenches will win this game or lose this game if you're Ohio State or you're Tennessee. James Pierce on that defensive line for Tennessee, really good player. Like Ohio State, you got to have a plan to be able to block an edge like that. And you flip it over to the other side. Tennessee loves to run the football. It is the best part of their offense. Ohio State, their defensive line, at times, big games, they will no-show. right? Do the trenches show up for these teams? And whoever's playing better is going to win the game.
Well, and also, what did we learn about their game plan against Michigan, right? It was such a terrible offensive game plan where they did not play into their strengths, and they really clearly wanted to make a point and, like, run the ball up the middle into Michigan's best
Two
defenders.
first-rounders in there, yeah.
So that's got to change, right? Like, Ohio State's got to air it out. You've got to throw the ball to JJ. Like, you've got to do the things that are your best at.
They're going to potentially try to run it to more space, run it on the edges. They had a lot of boundary side runs.
Yeah, but not just like right at the heart of the defensive front.
If they didn't learn from that game plan, then this whole thing is just asinine. But I do think they're going to be better prepared. They got more time to prepare for a game like this as well. Like, I do think it comes down to how healthy is Ohio State? Do they get the combinations up front that they like? And then, are they going to be able to have a run game that can at least be a factor? And will they stop Tennessee's run?
Right.
If those things don't happen, I feel very confident about Tennessee winning that game.
I think you're also, an X factor here is a young and inexperienced quarterback at Tennessee.
Yeah.
We've seen him make some immature, I want to say freshman, but I think he's like a redshirt freshman, whatever
some
he is
young
now.
mistakes.
Yeah, but stepping out of bounds, like not understanding exactly where we are in the clock and things like that. So that's a lot on Nico Iamaleava as well.
I mean, we saw Will Howard.
Okay, Will Howard also had trouble with not knowing where the clock was.
He's a competitor, but we've seen it on both sides. I mean, is this one where weather could be a factor too for a Tennessee team coming up? And they're not as far south as some of the other teams, but the horseshoe might be a little chilly.
Well, you've also made this point that you think the atmosphere and the home field advantage is more apparent at a night game as well.
Yeah. Oh, no. I mean, the night atmosphere at Ohio Stadium is completely different than noon. You sent me the tweet from
they were celebrating not
the
getting
Ohio
a noon
State
game.
official football account. But the fans are going to celebrate too during the game, so long as their team is playing well. It's the other thing about it. Like, the Boo Birds have been out this year, and it's not something that has historically happened in Ohio Stadium. But if they get off to a slow start, like we've seen, that crowd could easily become a non-factor, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, a little bit, not as much a home field advantage as it might be. So that one's going to be a really fun one. A lot at stake for both teams.
Oh, no doubt.
And love just that SEC Big Ten matchup, because I think we love to take narratives away from that into the offseason. All right, Joshua, it is time to make national championship picks.
Okay.
I'm putting you on the spot. I'm going to make you go first. As we look at the bracket, we talked about this, right? Oregon, #1 overall seed. Georgia, path looks pretty clear, I think, depending on how terrified you are of, let's say, Notre Dame or Indiana. Penn State and Texas might have an easier quarterfinal matchup to get to the semis. Walk me through your picks and who's going to win it all.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at Georgia, and certainly I do like their path. I think there's a question about who's playing quarterback and how healthy, how good is the quarterback playing. So kind of leaning away from that for that very reason. Penn State, I mentioned, this is the opportunity. I fully expect Penn State to be in the semis, and then anything can happen from that point. They pushed Oregon around up front, ran the ball extremely well. As you mentioned, Drew Aller played a great game. And if that defensive front gets going, the secondary is not an issue. Like, they have a shot. But ultimately, I think I like Oregon because I like Oregon. Yeah. They've been consistent all year long. Dylan Gabriel, phenomenal, can use his legs, really accurate with his arm. And there are some throws that he made blind in the Big Ten championship game that were really good. And then their defense, very porous, but they've got athletes out there. They like to hit, and typically they've played better throughout the season. Oregon just feels like a team right now that is on a national championship path.
They also have made stops when they've needed to in some of these big games. I mean, what we saw Penn State do to them was something that we haven't really seen some of the good offenses that they've gone up against do. I'm also going to ride with Oregon. This was a team that I picked in the preseason as my national championship
look
pick.
At you being right. Potentially.
Hey, at least they're the #1 overall seed. That does make me look pretty good. I also had Dylan Gabriel as my preseason Heisman pick, and I think in a different format, like the 4-team playoff, Dylan Gabriel probably wins the Heisman because he'd be the quarterback of one of the teams we're talking about all season, but we've been casting a wider net, paying attention to more teams this year, and that's why I hope he is at least a finalist in New York City, but I trust him. I don't think that there's that many quarterbacks this year that I trust, like I trust Dylan Gabriel to make the right decisions, to set his teammates up for success. He's got amazing weapons, and we see them. The tight ends, Tez Johnson, he's got dudes to get the ball to in space, and that's where Oregon really thrives. I just don't know that many teams are going to be able to stop them. They have survived their clunkers.
Yep.
They have survived the ups and downs. They've
Yep.
been up for big games. They played well. They have made no doubt about how good they can be. And Dan Lanning, master motivator as well. So I feel like they'll be able to weather the ups and downs of this bracket. Like, it's going to take a while. You're going to need to be a really talented and a deep team to win the college football playoff with this many games against good teams. The bye certainly helps. I think even in a rematch against Ohio State, I believe Oregon should have won that game by more. I think they left points out on the field in Autzen. I think they could beat Tennessee. I think they can beat Texas, Arizona State, whoever they're going to play in the semifinals as well. So I certainly think the Ducks are good enough to do it. I think they could end up being the great team in a year where we think maybe there's some good teams but not great ones. They might be that great team.
I'm totally there. You mentioned the quarterback trustworthiness. Like, I don't even think there's a question about it with the quarterbacks in this field. And it's not to disrespect any of those other guys. Dylan Gabriel's just been that consistent all year long. This is a low variance team, right? Like, we've seen Ohio State when they're playing their best ball. I like them a lot. When they're playing their worst ball, they'll lose to a team that they have no business losing to. Like, you can make that argument for a lot of teams out here. Texas, we don't quite know what the variance is because the only good team they've played is Georgia. Like,
and they struggled,
you know,
in different ways, both times.
Lingering in the back of your mind. I will say, though, in terms of the depth, the one thing that did stand out to me for Oregon is their D-line rotation in the Big Ten championship game wasn't as deep as I thought it was going to be. I think in this postseason, you got to roll all the bodies through there. You got to be able to trust the guys. I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue, though, because they do have guys that can take over at that spot anyway.
Yeah, and I think the quick strike ability of their offense is something that when your back's against a wall in a game, they can do that. They can get themselves back in. It's interesting, though, because I do think depth is going to be really important. Veteran players, experienced players, guys who have been through something like this before. And that's why I think Georgia's going to go deep in this bracket.
Yeah,
I know they've been really inconsistent this year, but like that, the roster is there. Like, Kirby has built a roster that has the type of depth to survive a couple injuries, to survive the wear and tear of these games. Notre Dame, we've seen do it, so I also feel decent about them, although I don't know if they have like receivers that can break open a game. So that's something that is a factor that I don't think we know how it's going to impact the playoff yet.
Right, and like for Notre Dame, coaching-wise, love Marcus Freeman. We've seen him rise to the occasion in the big games, and so I think there's some confidence that comes from that. Haven't necessarily seen him like make a playoff run, and so we got to see that. I think that's where the Georgia pick is enticing for a lot of people.
For Kirby.
We know who Kirby is in these situations. We know big game Kirby, right? Like, he goes on the road to Texas and gets a win, gets the rematch. Oh, you know, it's hard to beat the same team twice. Well, is it?
Yeah.
Like, he does it, and it's a big game. And so I think there is confidence from watching Kirby operate that he might be able to put it together.
Yeah, Dan Lanning has not yet won a national championship. He's still the coach that I would pick today if I was starting a program.
He's been around all the guys who have won them, too.
He's been on rosters. He has been on staff.
He knows how they do it.
He knows how they do it. One thing that I think is going to be really cool is getting Dan Lanning in the playoff. That type of opportunity and spotlight for him, who, again, that's who I would want as my coach in 2024 in college football.
Who he is? Without being a complete psychopath, he's young Urban Meyer. Master motivator. Right? Like, he cares about special teams, will try to find the edges in the game. He is a phenomenal recruiter. Like, just the energy and the enthusiasm on game day, and putting together a program right now that might be able to win a national title.
Yeah, will he be the next coach to win a national championship? We will find out here over the next few weeks. Joshua and I will have plenty of coverage here on Rushing the Field. We'll have game previews, reactions, and so much more over the next, 6 weeks?
Yeah,
it's going to be, we've got a long season ahead
it
still.
is.
We do. But for Joshua Perry, I'm Nicole Auerbach. This is Rushing the Field, and we will see you soon.